the third anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and there are talks about peace talks. Peace or armistice? And how are they going so far? Peace at a price, if the price is right. Join me, Jan Darasz, for How We Got Here.
3 years, tens of thousands of lives lost, around 19% of Ukraine's territory occupied, innumerable homes and civilian infrastructure razed to the ground. This is the toll of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's difficult, if not impossible, to speak about the precise number of casualties, as both sides of the conflict have been shy or biased in the assessment of their own losses. Figures released by Kyiv, UN statistics, and open-source data published by BBC Russia show the total death toll of Ukrainian and Russian soldiers, as well as Ukrainian civilians, at over 148,000 as of February 13th. But again, the actual number is almost certainly much more appalling. Territory-wise, since the beginning of the war in 2014, Russia's control of Ukraine's territory has fluctuated, peaking in March 2022 at 27%, then decreasing to the ever lowest of nearly 18% in December 2023, when the second Ukrainian counteroffensive ended. Today, Russia still holds 19% of Ukraine's territory, including Crimea. As statistics continue being updated due to ceaselessly unfolding hostilities, the word of peace talks appears on global lips ever more often. The problem is that Russia is not really a credible negotiator. At the end of the first Chechen war, Russia, having suffered heavy losses, signed a peace agreement with Chechen separatists, effectively granting de facto independence to the republic. However, Moscow did not genuinely accept Chechenya's sovereignty, and used the interwar period to lull the republic's vigilance and weaken it politically. In 1999, the empire struck back with a full-scale invasion under the pretext of fighting terrorism, completely disregarding the prior agreement. The war resulted in brutal suppression and installation of a pro-Kremlin regime. If the Budapest Memorandum should tell you anything, then it is nukes for security. And that's what happened in 1994. Ukraine gave up all of its nuclear arsenal in exchange for security guarantees from the US, the UK, and Russia. We know what happened 20 years later. To de-escalate fighting in eastern Ukraine, 2 Minsk agreements were signed in 2014 and 2015 respectively. But despite signing both of the agreements, Russia continued arming, funding, and leading separatist forces, undermining any real peace efforts. As it happened, Moscow used the agreements to stall for time, reinforcing its proxy forces and preparing for its full-scale invasion in 2022. And lastly, despite multiple rounds of peace talks in 2022, Russia showed no real intention of negotiating in good faith. It continued military offensives while pretending to seek a settlement. Russia has also consistently violated humanitarian agreements, such as safe corridors for civilian evacuations, by shelling agreed-upon routes. A new phase of ceasefire negotiations is to take place in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia on February 25th, in line with the US President Donald Trump's announcement.
I'm delighted once more to welcome our guest today, Witold Rodkiewicz, from the Centre for Eastern Studies based here in Warsaw. Welcome once more.
Thank you very much for having me. It's always a pleasure.
What were your immediate thoughts and evaluations of these talks between Russia and the United States on Ukraine?
Well, I went through ups and downs, or downs and ups, I would say, and down again. So it was a kind of sinusoid experience. Because first the telephone that was held between Mr. Trump and Vladimir Putin, the Russian chief, it's the way it was phrased, the communique, and seemed like it was in spite of the spin that was put on it by the White House and by President Trump, I thought that, looking at it dispassionately, I thought that the American side was really conceding things that it shouldn't have at the beginning of the negotiation process. The issues about the equality of it's a kind of parity between the assumed parity between, or equality between the two sides, namely the Russian and the Ukrainian. There's implication that it's possible to the implication that Mr. Trump has accepted the main goals of Russian war, namely the neutralization of Ukraine, basically the ban on its entry to NATO, and acceptance of territorial losses or military conquest done by Russia. But then the Riyadh meeting, and I read the communique and I heard out the interviews with the American participants, but also reading the Russian official communiques, which is surprising. There seemed to be something positive emerging, namely all these things that I mentioned before were still somehow implicitly there or explicitly, but there was this connection established, namely that any improvement in relations, which the Russian side desperately wants, especially in the economic sphere, sanctions and joint economic projects are to be implemented only after the Ukrainian issue is settled. So only after the agreements come the reward, which is logical and seems like a good strategy. Of course, another key question is on what terms this agreement is going to be. But that was also not specified anywhere, and the Russians were happy about the fact that it started, but they were not quite happy. So you could see that, and they were quite relatively open, I think, sincere about this, saying, "Okay, this is just the beginning of the process. It's great. It's fantastic, and we have great hopes." But so far, nothing has been, nothing has been decided, and we have to be careful. We haven't. There's still a game.
Yes.
But then President Trump comes out next day and makes his remarks about President Zelensky, about Ukraine, about putting the whole thing in terms that are completely opposite to reality, namely that the Ukraine is this made it appear like the Ukraine was the side that really is guilty in this. Is to be blamed for the war, and President Zelensky is somebody who should be really removed from power, which is again repeating to a large extent, or perhaps not repeating, but it coincides with the Russian consistent, and especially after during the last half a year, consistent line that Zelensky is no longer legitimate, and this Russian gambit, or not a gambit, but maneuver, in which they try to create as a kind of assumed background that they can choose who is legitimate authority in Ukraine, with whom they can choose who they can with whom they should negotiate about the end of the war, and implicating that Zelensky is no longer legitimate. And since the American side, in this case President Trump himself, were going in the same direction, this augured quite badly for the future, because it seemed that again the top decision maker, we know that in this White House, and we know that from the past, from the previous administration, this is it's almost like this Oriental despotism in which it's not even Western absolutism, which on the one hand, the power is absolute, but it's supposed to be exercised in a orderly and legal manner. And here we have a complete arbitrariness, yes. I would say, at the top. So this arbitrariness, and when we see that the person who is exercising this arbitrary power has ideas like that, and he seems to be interested in having a deal for the deal's sake.
Yes, as quickly as possible.
As quickly as possible. This is not a good. This is not a good. Line. This is not a good situation.
We've talked about the Russian philosophy as it pertains to its negotiation practices. Both these presidents have a reputation as being micromanagers, if that's accurate. Isn't this just the case that, as you said, the American side wants a deal for a deal's sake and it wants it quickly, and the Russians can just wait?
Yes, the Russians can wait without. Okay, theoretically, there is a risk that if they wait too long, Trump might become disappointed and angry, but there is also a big chance that he might become disappointed and just lose interest in the whole thing. There is a small chance that it might work out badly for them, but I think the overwhelming chance is that this is going to work for them well, and they can. And it's clear that they are trying to take advantage of this desire of Trump to have quick results, and they are delaying things a bit, saying, okay. We are ready to deal, but maybe not so quickly. And then here are our conditions, and they are gradually revealing or bringing back, or because the conditions are their demands, what they want are pretty clear, and experts know about this. But in terms of playing with Trump, they kind of revealing their real agenda gradually, hoping that he will be ready to give up everything just to have an image of success, a kind of a phony success, which is success only because Trump says it is a success. Yes. But if you look at the real consequences, even from the point of view of the sort of American interest, as he seemed to understand them. The consequences are going to be extremely serious and extremely negative.
Yes, and also we must bear in mind that in the Korean War, the negotiations dragged on for 2 years.
3 years.
3 years, while the fighting got more and more bitter.
And it was only negotiations about a ceasefire.
Yes.
And here the Russians are making clear that they are not interested in a ceasefire. And I think they already won this point, because at the beginning, this tension that was in the period before that phone call. By the way, we don't know who called whom, which is again the sides decided not to reveal this, which is interesting. But the Russians were saying, we are not interested in just a ceasefire. If you want to stop the war, you have to give more. We are not willing to stop the war without getting something for it. And they're quite effective in reversing the logic, because the logic of Trump seems to have been, if you want, first you give me you agree to a ceasefire, and they reverse the logic and say, okay, if you want to ceasefire, you have to pay us.
Yes.
And I think this is the stage we are in, although as far as I know, nothing has been yet established and put on paper, and we are still waiting for the appointment of the teams that are going to take to negotiate this. But one interesting thing, and again, it's a concession on the American side, on the White House side, because it's a small informal, but nevertheless, I think it's significant and it kind of sets the stage again. Namely, it's the American side that is supposed to reveal who is going to be negotiating, and Vladimir Putin is going to nominate his representatives only after he learns who is going to be negotiating on the American side. Potentially, of course, this is part of the negotiating technique. You know who you are dealing with. You should have a dossier. You know the weak points, and then you choose there's a whole kind of science about this, and then you choose an appropriate counterpart who you would think, because of his skills and his psychological makeup, would be the most effective in dealing with this particular group.
Yes, in the sporting world, it's happened loads of times where one manager just wants the other team to announce their
you would like to know which players your team is going to field.
What's the when you look back on the history of Soviet U.S. and then later Russian U.S. negotiations, is this a consistent theme that you can pick out, that the United States negotiation teams just wants a deal, wants to get things sewn up, wants the contract to be signed, and the Russians are a bit more canny about how they manipulate?
I think there was always inbuilt advantage to the Soviet side, namely they didn't have the political pressure coming from the electoral cycle. For the most important negotiations, of course, were the strategic arms negotiations between the Soviets and the Americans during the Cold War, and there, the presidents had, a certain period in which they were more, they had to finish before the campaign started, and the Soviets actually knew about this, studied this, and was trying to sort of position their strategy in terms of when they would want to talk and about what topics, and how to sort of structure in terms of schedule the negotiations. They had an advantage, and there was an inbuilt advantage that you can't do anything about it really. But the Americans were, compared with the situation now, the American teams were very professional, were very good, and there were some effective negotiators. Paul Nietzsche comes to mind as a kind of the person who established himself as a kind of a key figure, an effective negotiator. But one thing that the Americans lacked, and this is for example, Richard Pipes was always saying that he was shocked when he came to the White House as the main Russia hand for the Soviet hand in the National Security Council in 1980, and he found out that there is no record available because every president takes the record with him, so there's no one place in which the record of all the negotiations is available, and it's important, where the Russians are extremely good in keeping the record keeping, and their negotiators, their teams have all the records, who said what were the positions, what was their position. It's such a basic tool, but without it, if you don't have it, you are really at a disadvantage, at a serious disadvantage.
Yes, and it's all about advantages, disadvantages, stratagems, manipulation.
Yes, but also it's also the judge, because the American side, of course, always assumed, and in a way they were right. There was one pressure that was working on the Russian side, and this was they didn't enter into these negotiations on arms limitations without a reason. They had a reason. They had a pressing reason. They really needed to reduce the defense burden on their budget. And this was an inbuilt advantage for the American side during the Cold War, that American economy was so much more efficient and so much more powerful, simply larger than the Soviet economy. So, and they were working, especially in the 70s, when the system became less dependent for its survival on coercion on open coercion, on sort of physical coercion, and more on kind of consent that was predicated, was built upon on providing this new Soviet society in the early 70s some level of basic welfare. So this is what the Americans played. The Soviets had other. In the end, I have to say that the team that President Reagan put was in this case very good, and Richard Pipes also played a part in it.
We have to leave it there, unfortunately. Fascinating discussion about the history of these negotiations. Witold, Rodkiewicz, thanks very much once more for coming into the programme.
Thank you very much.
As usual, we've run out of time, but join us again Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays, 2:15 CET. So, see you then.